Mamady Doumbouya, who took over Guinea in a military coup back in 2021, just won the presidential election with a massive 87% of the vote. Now, it's a major turning point because he originally promised he will not run for office and will instead hand power back to a civilian leader. Now, he's set to move from being a military ruler to a formal elected president once the court clears the final results. However, many people are calling the whole process a sham, since his biggest rivals were either banned from the race or forced to stay out of the country. There wasn't much real competition. Now, opposition groups mostly stayed home in protest, arguing that the deck was stacked from the start. Even with the borders closed and the military keeping a tight grip on things, the big question now is whether the international community or the Guinean people will actually accept this as a fair win. To unpack this, I'm joined by Dr. Sam Amadi, Director, the Abuja School of Social and Political Thought. Thank you so much for joining us on this show, Dr. Amadi.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's hear your thoughts on the recently concluded elections in Guinea, because the Electoral Authority has credited Doumbouya with 86.72% of the vote. Official figures also claim an 80.95% turnout, yet we have opposition reports suggesting that the streets were empty in many strongholds. So how can the government claim such a high participation while the main opposition coalition, that's Forces Vive de Guinea, called for a total boycott?
Well, thank you for having me. Again, percentage of win also depends on percentage of those who turn out to vote. Again, in many of these African countries, the electoral bodies do not have the credibility to be independent, impartial, and to count the votes fairly. So it's not entirely surprising. With the other time, so in Tanzania, the vote approximating the region of 80 to 100. I've seen some other places where perhaps incredible figures are released as the percentage of win. So first is that if you look at the electoral body, the Director General of Election, the General Director of Election was just constituted mid last year, sometime in June. This is all rushed, and many of the opposition leaders boycotted. Some were disqualified when the final list was prepared, and significant call for boycott. So it's reasonable to assume that many of them did not vote, and that even those who voted, you're not going to have fair count of votes. Guinea has been a military dictatorship, and now they are going to perhaps an electoral autocracy. We saw reports by independent observers around violation of rights, the quality of even the process and the voting. So if you look at democratic elections and look at criteria for assessing or confirming elections are democratic, both build up pre and during voting, this is not one of those poster child of, real credible elections.
All right. Now, speaking of it being democratic and credible, because remember in 2021, Doumbouya famously said, and I quote, that if the people are crushed by their elites, it is up to the army to give the people their freedom. So if he is now the elected elite, would you say that he has fulfilled that promise, or as his critics say, has become the very grave digger of democracy that he warned against? Because also the new constitution approved in September revoked the ban on junta members running for office as well. So to what extent was this entire 4-year transition, simply a long-form campaign for military entrenchment? What is this actually all about?
That's what it is, military entrenchment. And again, it parallels what we've seen elsewhere, even in Nigeria during the Babangida and Abacha days. So what happens that the military rarely, the military that takes over power in Africa rarely is an outsider. Oftentimes, they are the bastion that has supported and strengthened strengthened local civilian despots and dictators. And at a point, they shoved them away, take over power, not to inaugurate or disrupt the establishment and inaugurate democratic rule or even progressive military rule, but essentially to hold to power themselves. And so after pressure, they stabilize and then they transition to a pseudo-democracy, which is, they remain authoritarians, but now they have the transformation of being civilians who won election, no matter how manipulated or scripted, and that gives them the credibility to deploy democratic rhetoric and continue to exercise power. So what is common to whether they are military or they are out of military is the emphasis on protecting aristocratic status quo, which they belong as virtue of a military elite. So as Nigerian fella and club will always put it, is when the civilians are there, it's the military that gives them, that strengthens them, that anchors them, and at the point the military shoves them away when multiplicity of factors, the misrule is massive, people are angry, and then they use opportunity to displace them and take over, and basically now need a coalition of bankrupt status quo politicians and the military establishment, and those that succeed creates a new form of, like Doumbouya. I mean, many of these guys who are today democratic quote-unquote despots who have maintained long reign in power, whether it's Museveni, they all came from the military. They all came to disrupt what was then a decadent democratic rule or civilian rule, and they all became the democratic rulers themselves, but keeping to their authoritarian strategies, logic, and holding power in the same, if you like, dictatorial grip. But you don't see just one or two, perhaps, in Burkina Faso with the young revolutionary was killed, and then maybe a couple of them you see once in a while a really disruptive military ruler who comes to inaugurate a new social order, and oftentimes they don't live long to tell the story.
All right, now, so many people seem to think that ECOWAS, has a double standard when it comes to Guinea because they hail the peaceful nature of the vote despite minor irregularities. And, we know that Doumbouya chose to stay within ECOWAS rather than joining, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso alliance as well. So would you say that his strategic loyalty has bought him a pass when it comes to ECOWAS, from the international community for his controversial election?
So what we are learning from international politics is that international politics is first politics. So ECOWAS itself will play politics. They need to have one role in ECOWAS. ECOWAS is being kind of facing pressure, becoming irrelevant. If one or two more countries join the other alternative, then probably ECOWAS has collapsed or purpose. So it's self-serving and self-preservatory for ECOWAS to treat Guinea differently as they do. I mean, look, election observation is a cotton industry that has been annexed to everything wrong about democracy in Africa. So they go there, they report a couple of procedural issues, thank the government for putting a good election, recommend electoral bodies some actions to take, remedial actions, and pass off, endorse the outcome, and that gives an international, a regional official imprimatur on the election itself. So that has been the tragedy. That's the trajectory. So nothing new. ECOWAS would, again, ECOWAS, African Union, the logic, the overriding logic is like the boys' club to protect sovereignty. And once you are successful, whether it's a coupist, and then you try to go through the motion of election, then you're in good standing. ECOWAS has not been very rigorous in identifying and objecting to rig the election. Otherwise, many of the leaders, including Nigeria, and others will be facing a lot of questions to answer. So I've been on delegation to ECOWAS to Togo many years ago to observe elections. It never gets to the show, the push never gets to a show. So you never see ECOWAS really stamp down and say this election is legitimate, fails to meet the criteria, and we don't recognize that the government. Never. So it's in keeping with tradition to fault a few things, but generally affirm the outcome.
All right. Now, speaking of outcomes, let's quickly, hint on a few things, incidents that actually happened in the lead up to the election, because UN High Commissioner Volker Turk noted apparent politically motivated and enforced disappearances leading up to the vote. And we also know that there were several major stations and news sites were restricted in the months prior, and the fact that there were 12,000 security personnel deployed for the vote. Now, when all legal avenues for dissent, are closed, as we have seen with the exile of the political class as well, what are the risks?
Well, the risk is that first, you have shut down democratic dissent, which is civil, manageable, because they are rational, public reason. People are like a few things to address them, the costs are there. Democracy is built around what we call intercession. So you go to either parliamentary intercession or you go to judicial intercession. So different areas you can intercede and ask for help, to validate your complaints. But when there are no possibilities of complaint, and when exactly, especially, there is no competitive election, and it's clear that you're going to get 70%, 80%, irrespective of whether the government delivers or whether the opposition has a better message or better approval, it's going to be 78%, 80% for the incumbent. Then it's kind of creates strong incentive to move away from the trajectory of democratic intercession, validation, and remediation, and they tend to suffer. So that's why sooner or later the opposition will either become a form of militants who are going to be subversive to the social order, who are going to become mercenaries, and that's what you see happen all the time. And then there will be some kind of civil war, whether it's low tension or high tension civil war. So the failure to allow democracy to grow, the failure to provide opportunity for contestation, for competitive elections, will force a sense of helplessness which mutates into violence against the state. And because African states are ideologically and structurally weak, they cannot maintain the level of dictatorship they try to, they can't be China. Oftentimes they think that, China is not a democracy, but China is ideologically coherent. And the Chinese political leadership structure, no ethnicity, no, in Africa, there are still questions around legitimacy, questions around ethnic, contestations, identity. So the notion that you're going to foreclose democratic opening space, close down the spaces, means that you are going to inevitably buy for yourself violent, resistance and attack that, mutates into civil war and ultimately collapse of the state. So it's ironic that authoritarian rule, constituting power, driving away opposition, will end up weakening the regime and thoroughly, disarming the state. So that's really the tragedy here. We see that repeatedly.
Okay. Now, with that, we'll be wrapping up this particular segment and the show as well. But thank you so much, Dr. Sam Mamady, Director of the Abuja School of Social and Political Thought. We appreciate you for your time.
Thank you so much.